a really quick intro on the World War One TV, but this is what is said about the book we are talking about. A remarkable eyewitness-based view of the outbreak of the First World War. That's what Dan Snow said of Ring of Fire, and I'm delighted to welcome the two authors of that book to World War One TV, and we are also streaming to World War Two TV. You can watch either, or you can watch both and have one on mute. Then that way we get double the views. Anyway, I'll bring them in now. Good afternoon, evening. So Alex, you've been on plenty of times before, so I'll have you, Alex, introduce your co-author, Nicolai.
I would like to introduce you all to Nicolai Eberholst, or Eberholst. How do you like it said? I've never even asked you.
Well, that started well.
Yeah.
Have you met each other?
Yeah, so I'll tell you about the first time we met when I went to Copenhagen, and he literally had to get on the phone and argue with customs to get me let in the country because the COVID restrictions changed in midair. And also his wife's brilliant one-liner about meeting me was fantastic. But Nikolai is a historian who specialized, well, he used to specialize, so he does the Austria-Hungarian army, which is where we rooted him out for history hacks. We were like, oh, this is absolute nerd in Denmark that does nothing but bang on about Austria-Hungary in the war, which was great. So he did a 3-parter for us. But Nikolai's master's topic was the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian army in Italy. And he's a trustee of the Great War Group as well. And about 4 years ago, we started having a conversation about, is there really a new way to tell the story of the First World War? And now we're here. But yeah, hi, Nikolai.
Hello.
So, I mean, the thing about, as I've been learning on my learning curve about the Great War and the interwar period, is it all links together. And for me, as an unashamed World War II guy, I have to understand World War One. Now, your book is obviously about 1914. We'll come into how you got the writing process worked, but how much of the pre-1914 stuff do you include? Because I remember Mark Morris's book about 1066, where he starts it in about 600 or something rather, and says, yeah, I know there's 400 years of preamble, but you need to understand all this to get to where we're going to take you. So with what you just said about Nikolai there and empires and things, I mean, where does it start? Does it strictly start in 1914, or do you have to do this contextual understanding of what this weird kind of geopolitical, I'm allied with you, so you're allied with me, so you're my friend, which means you're my friend? Give us a rundown, Alex.
So we started doing that, and we spent about 9 months on that, and we came up with an amazing amount of stuff. But we're conscious of the fact that once you start doing that stuff, your word count gets hammered.
Yeah.
And then brilliantly, we decided to do the whole thing from the perspective of ordinary men, women, and children, which means we get to sack off all of that and literally start, don't we, Nikolai, in July, August 1914?
Yeah, I think it's a little disappointing answer, maybe, that we don't really go into a lot of it before, and we don't really do a lot of the July crisis as well, because it's been told before. One of the first lines in the books is that we don't really ask the how, the why, but the how. Right. It's not so much a book where we go into and follow politicians and we follow a long history of diplomatic events. It's more the experience from how do normal people experience it once it kicks off. So we really think that's going to be
the key thing, isn't it, Alex? Because as we were talking with Victoria Taylor last night on World War II TV about the perceptions of the Battle of Britain, is that we've all got our perceptions of that. And I think 1914, particularly if you're British, Australian, and the English language speaking countries, I think there's definitely a perception of it, and probably as well from the French speaking countries. But you're actually putting it, a lot of the book, in the words of the people who were there. So when you began this process, did you feel that, broadly speaking, the people who were there witnessed it completely differently to how we think it was perceived at the time, or were they sort of in line with what your perceptions were?
I think we both enjoy writing more the kind of history where you go and dump the reader in the midst of events where nobody has any hindsight and nobody knows what the ending is going to be. And that was, I think, was our number one rule throughout the entire book. I don't think with the July crisis, we did the work. We honestly did. We translated so much stuff and we could rattle on about that for ages. But we just decided that the perception everybody has is kind of shaped by accounts of sort of great white men stalking the corridors of power. And like I said, because we decided not to do that, it meant we got to sack off the July crisis. So where we would have had to spend like 10,000 words going, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then, you know, you get the chain, the domino chain of people declaring war on each other. We got to sack all of that off and spend 10,000 words instead, saying what it actually felt like to ordinary people who suddenly had this dumped on them. But I think the reason we started writing and the reason we chose this angle, I'm going to let Nikolai tell you why we basically did this to spite the guns of August.
Yeah, I mean, that's maybe a little rough, but or harsh. But what we really wanted to do was we didn't want it to be so much a book that just followed everything that happened on the Western Front. We wanted it to be a global history as well, and include in equal measure what happens in the West and what happens in the East and what happens in the Balkans and what happens in the wider world, because it's all connected. So what Guns of August, of course, doesn't include much about is everything that doesn't happen on what would become the Western Front. So we really wanted to bring it in, and I think that's why we found out that it would be a very good idea to work together, because we have very little overlapping interests when it comes to the First World War.
We have nothing in common inside World War. Nothing.
Well, it seemed like you met the first time today on the show. So I mean, that's a good time to ask you, how did you do the process? Because every time I speak to a historian about how they do their research or how they do their writing, it's like, it sounds completely alien to me, because everybody has a completely different way of doing it. And some people, you know, bury themselves in a shed on their own for hours or days. On other people, it's very collaborative. You know, did you take on sections each and then read each other's work? Did you divide and conquer? Or what was the process?
So broadly speaking, the stuff in the East and the Balkans, that's all Nikolai. The stuff in the West is all me, apart from the fact that Nikolai had to do the German translation for that. So I'll tell you a bit of the story about when we'd finally had enough of working on the book around his table during the Battle of the Marne about 8 weeks before we were due to hand in. We had a bit of a wobbly, but remarkably, we didn't have we didn't have a fight. We didn't even have a disagreement that lasted longer than one person explaining why they didn't agree and the other person going, oh yeah, actually makes kind of sense. So like he says, we don't have anything in common interest-wise. Like, he doesn't do sand, deserts, the African stuff. I cringe every time I see a map of the Balkans. I don't understand the place names and it confuses me. And now I have a Nicolai to do it for me, so it's fantastic. So when you mashed it together, I think we agreed that for someone to do this and do this properly, like a global appreciation of the First World War, there wasn't really one person who could write this book, because the amount of niche stuff. I've read a 350-page book about the Dutch East Indies in the First World War, like the lengths we went to, and the academic work that we researched of people that had really niche specialities and stuff to be able to cover this. It was exhausting at times. But we didn't, like, we were talking about it and we were saying, I don't think any one person that we know of in First World War circles has all of the language skills you'd need to do this, or all of the interests, because there isn't one front in this that didn't have a person who was previously heavily invested in researching in it. And I don't think there's one person out there that could say that they knew all of it about all of the fronts. Some of them required more work than others. Like, I went over to America to write the imperial stuff. So what we did we decided that the imperial, neutral, and naval stuff, you couldn't really separate it out. It was also hopelessly intertwined, and Nikolai absolutely does not do boats. So that was mine. But the trade-off was, well, okay, then you get the atrocities. So he did that chapter. And I'll let him tell you about the experience.
This is fun.
Yeah, the 500-page report on Balkan atrocities in the First World War. So yeah, by the time you mashed us both together, it was remarkably stress-free. We've been told we were very professional as well. But yeah, there was only one moment where we had a full Paddy meltdown over the Battle of the Marne, and Nikolai's wife came home from work and just said, when we were like, we just don't want it. I don't want to do any more French. She doesn't want to do any more German. This sucks. And she's like, oh, get over yourselves. You're pathetic. And we were like, all right.
I mean, the fact you brought up the language there, that's the thing, isn't it? Is that there does seem to be a a tidal wave of trying to look at conflict from that contextual. Indy Nidell says nothing happens in a vacuum. I know John Parshall's forthcoming book on 1942 juggles all the theaters and doesn't separate them. It's like each chapter is bouncing back and forth from what's happening in one city to the other. And I think we're probably all a bit guilty of looking at First World War through our national lenses and through our what we want our nations to, what we think our nations were mainly involved in. So for the British and the Australians, it's trenches, it's the Western Front, it's Blackadder, all the same old tropes that we churn out every single time. And of course, everybody else is going to war, and indeed a lot of the fighting that eventually got going was not trench warfare, it was mountain warfare, and as you say, naval warfare, all things like that. So, but obviously you're just covering 1914, so that approaching it from a different angle, all those angles, that was obviously a key part of what you wanted to achieve with this book. Yes.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, we don't really even cover all of 1914. We cover about from the outbreak of the war in the last days of July and until around the 11th of September. So it's only the very first weeks, but then looked at through this massive global perspective and what happens everywhere around the globe. When we talked about languages as well, and we talked about how we also worked and back and forth, one of the things we really also wanted to capture was that both-sidedness, because sometimes we only see specific battles from one perspective. So one thing we really wanted to try and find was this. Alex would tell me, okay, I have a brilliant account of this thing happening in this place on that day in Belgium. Can you find me a quote from a German that experienced the exact same thing? And in some cases we have, a French guy saying, okay, we attacked up a hill, and then we have a German saying we attacked over the hill, and then they meet, and we have people who quite literally stood face to face, and then later wrote about it. So trying to find those little moments and saying, okay, we attacked that wood, and we have the other guy defending that wood. What was the experience in those clashes? And also bringing in, now you mentioned the British, the big one for this period is of course the Battle of Mons, and it takes up a frighteningly small number of pages in our book compared to what's happening in the East or with the French. And we also try to then do it from a different perspective. So I think we have almost more accounts of the Germans, and in this case we have more accounts of the Danes, because a lot of the German soldiers were minority Danes. So we translated their accounts and used them to tell an already well-known story.
And I'll ask you both about this, is that that lots of photos, you've sent me some photos there, which we'll kind of put them up as we're talking, and because there's the reason the countries went to war, which is complicated or simple depending on your point of view, isn't it? It's kind of, if you kind of start breaking it all down, it gets complicated, but it is quite simple. It's about kind of loyalties and pacts and this, that, and the other, and then of course what happened in Sarajevo. But does what the countries wanted in 1914 have any bearing on what individuals thought they were going to war for? Because your book, as you sent me there, is plenty of pictures of people mobilizing. That's the one you said was one of your favorites, Alex. And so expat French in New York going off to fight, like that photo there that's on screen. What do you think a French person in 1914 was? What did he think he was fighting for?
I think the most important thing regarding the French is this idea of revenge for the Franco-Prussian War, and that is a lot less of a factor than you think it might be, unless they are literally the first troops to march across the border, in which case it's a massive deal for them, and we cover that. Or you live in one of those and you identify as French, then again, it's a massive deal for you. But it was a lot less widespread than we thought. I mean, that picture sums up one of the things I think that we didn't even realize when we started writing this, was that all of these countries that went to war expected people who had emigrated to go home, in inverted commas, and fight. And that's what these French people are doing. They've been summoned home to join the army. And I think we talk a lot about neutral countries as well, which we can get onto later. But like Italy expected not only Italians who had emigrated, but potentially the grandchildren of Italians who had emigrated to get on a boat and go to Italy and fight a war in a country that they'd never been to. And I think our stat, we worked with Van der Wilcox on making sure that we had all of the Italian stuff nailed. And there may have been as many 800,000 Italians who went, absolutely not, no thank you, and didn't go.
Wow. I mean, Stuart said there about Stuart Burbage about the French nationals. Were French nationals abroad contacted to report to their units, or did they make their own way back independently? I guess a bit of both, I suppose. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, and you get like, so Atlanta was a hub for Germans as well, from all across the South and Texas to go to. But then, of course, the Germans can't get home because they're not, it's breaking neutrality for them to get on a American boat and go back. And they can't get on a British boat and go back. So there were practicalities like that people couldn't deal with. But yeah, they would basically get summoned back, and presumably they knew exactly which regiment and which depot they had to go to. But lots of them did. And we had a diary entry from an Italian boy who lived in Belgium with his father. There were a lot of Italians working in Belgium, which was highly industrialized at the beginning of the war. And they all had to decide whether they were going to go home. And he wanted to stay. He was going to get a medical exemption, but his dad was determined to go back. And he said, well, I can't let him go on his own. So he went.
I mean, I've definitely never, can tell you, I'll let you talk in a second, Nick. I'd never really thought of the fact that there were people from a country but not living in that country. And given that I live in a country that I wasn't born, I should be aware of that. But that's something, even that alone, the fact that it's not just what your nationality is, it's where you happen to be living, and therefore your loyalties and who you feel duty bound to go and serve and protect and fight for blurs the line. And of course, we're looking at that also through the perspective of those who are watching World War II TV. Some of the nations were fighting against each other in World War II, were alongside each other in the First World War, and there are other changes in between that as well. So it gets a little bit complicated as to where loyalties and things like that sit. So, you talked about the different languages you've had to use, and we've got photos of people mobilized, Hungarians and Russian cavalry and Serbians and Belgians like that. Again, this is a kind of a broad question, but do you think across the different nations, east, west, north, south, was there a common theme of why they're funny? You said about the French, it was a feeling of revenge, but for the other nations, was it? Because patriotism seems a very easy thing to say, but I don't know that most of us could explain it. So have you, in all this process, what did people go to war for in 1914? I
think a lot of it is simply a word like duty. A lot of people simply felt a sense of duty, even maybe if they didn't agree. I mean, you had Austro-Hungarians up on the screen before, a picture of them in newly mobilized, and from their perspective, I mean, there were many in Austria-Hungary who didn't like the idea of being in Austria-Hungary. Many of the different peoples. There were many who talks about independence or more independence or more of a say within the dual monarchy before the war. But once the war comes, there's also a sense of duty. And even when you see some of the more critical voices also feel that there's something they need to do, because there is a whole question about rights within the country. We talked about the Danes before in Mons. The Danes were very angry. They'd only been part of Germany for about 50 years before this, since 1864, and but were considered by then Germans and were then conscripted. And there was many who didn't think that they should go and fight. But at the same time, there was a feeling that, oh, then you have a duty to your home, because what happens if we lose the war and we were not supportive of, if Germany wins the war and we were not supportive of that war effort, then our rights as a minority might be further sort of cut down on. So there's a lot of sense of this, and where you see socialists, you see communists, you see almost revolutionaries still sign up and do their bit in a way. So I think that's probably the most common one.
I think as well, just I want to touch Phil Blood's here, and he's just said about the spirit of 1914. We spend nigh on a whole chapter talking about the different emotions people felt on going to war. And the first one we cover is that, because yes, it absolutely existed. But then I wrote this chapter. Absolutely. But we did the research together and I wrote it up finally. I make the point that saying that that was the only emotion that prevailed in 1914 is like looking at a work of art with your nose pressed up against the canvas, because you can only see the thing right in front of you. So we then spend a whole chapter talking about fear, talking about duty, talking about peer pressure, talking about all of the other emotions, and saying nobody feels one emotion in isolation. The same person that's out there celebrating on the streets and doing the whole spirit of 14 thing one day can be absolutely petrified and crying his eyes out at the thought of being mobilized the next as well. So I think we make the point that you need to step back and look at all of it to understand just the conflicting panic, fear, jubilation. In part, there's a huge sense of relief for a lot of people, because this tension has been building and building and building throughout July and August, and then it's over. Thank God it's over, and there's no more waiting to see what would happen. So yeah, there's a whole chapter where we examine the broader sort of impact of the outbreak of the war, and how but not only the men going off to fight, but everybody else felt about it. Because I think as well that as Brits, we think about those massive cues in the enthusiasm and the spirit. But what's important to say is we're nigh on the only country where you have 800,000 odd men, or however many it was, turn out and volunteer, because everywhere else in Europe, they didn't have a choice. They'd already been mobilized. We're the only ones that didn't instantly conscript all our available manpower. So you've got people running to recruitment offices in Germany, for instance, are really young or really old and just want to be part of it. People in Russia, there's a huge spate of people who have medical exemptions because they're privileged to get out of military service, who now want to tear those up because they want to go. But they're in much tinier numbers, because we are the only ones that have this huge reservoir, of manpower that hasn't yet been tapped. So those themes are uniquely British.
That's an interesting point there, and you also said, so let's bring it back that you do cover the neutral countries, because what was happening in some of those places was obviously relevant to the wider picture of public opinion. And there's so many parallels. We had John McManus on World War I TV last year talking about what was happening in the USA. So how important are the neutral countries and public opinion and groundswell of attitudes there to for example, an individual Belgian's motivation for fighting for his country? How much are they picking up on what the neutral countries are, for example, putting in the press, putting in the news? What's the influence of those neutral countries? Basically, is what I'm going to say.
Well, Nicolai is Danish, so
famously from one of the neutrals. I think this one was key almost from the beginning when we started this. It was one of the first things we said we wanted to cover, partly because also I knew about it, being that I'm from Denmark and I've done some studies of this before, and it sort of also hailed from this when I started looking into what happened in Denmark during the First World War. I found that in the beginning, it's very, very hard to if you didn't know where people were from, there's not a different reaction to a person in Copenhagen than there is to one in Berlin, because at that point, say 1st of August, 2nd of August, they don't know whether or not they're going to be neutral in a week. Things are moving incredibly fast, and neutral nations like Belgium and Luxembourg are being drawn in against their will. Nobody knows what's going to happen. It will happen later on that more nations suddenly become belligerent nations, even though they started out the war as being neutral. And if you took away the national moniker, if you will, you wouldn't really know the difference. The reaction to it is the same. And then when you then start to look into, what is the consequences of being neutral? Well, you're not just neutral. Neutrality doesn't really exist, because suddenly you have to contend with, all your trade is disrupted. You have to mobilize your army because you have to protect your national boundaries and territory.
It's Switzerland
Yeah.
mobilised more men than the BEF in August 1914. They mobilised 250,000 straight off. I think we played a game, didn't we, Nicolai, where if you shout any neutral nation out to us, we can tell you how they probably did something naughty or weren't neutral.
Yeah, well, neutrality is, it depends on the situations. That, I mean, you know, in my war, you know, there's Switzerland neutral, there's Ireland neutral, there's Sweden neutral. They're all very different definitions of neutral. And as you say,
Holland are the ones that are most belligerently neutral and determined to be neutral. And there's still evidence there that the Germans cut a corner across Dutch soil in the beginning of the war, and potentially violated that neutrality. But like Sweden, secret pact, Turkey, secret pact, Romania, king desperate to go in on the side of the Central Powers, makes a complete arse out of himself. It's one of my favourite anecdotes. He gets up in, so he's a constitutional monarch and he doesn't really get to say, but he gets up in a cabinet meeting and tries to convince all of his politicians that Romania should go in on the side of the Hohenzollerns because he is one. And he does his speech in French, which I find brilliant. And when he finishes, apparently you could hear a pin drop because everyone was just so shamed and embarrassed for him because it was pitiful. So yeah, like we said,
I feel seen now.
Yeah, any nation, chuck it at us, and I'll tell you how they breached neutrality, or they weren't, or they had something dodgy going on in the background. I think the Danes, I really like, Nicolai, that anecdote about, so the Germans demand that the Danes help them lay mines across the North Sea. And you can't really say no to a country that could absolutely kick your ass. So the Danes do it, but the very next day they level the score by passing this law so that no food can go from Denmark to Germany to feed the German army. So they kind of like, look what we did, please don't invade us. So yeah, it's the shithousery on display between all the different countries. Like Italy doesn't come on until 15, and yet by the 21st of August, Italy has redone all of her war plans with a scheme to invade Austria-Hungary. Turkey absolutely is going in on the side of Germany. It's why Churchill doesn't want to give him the 2 boats that are being built on the Tyne, and he seizes them. And I think one of my favourite anecdotes in the whole book is the angry Turkish. So there was a load of hate mail went to the British embassy in Constantinople because we seized these 2 boats. There were already Turkish sailors in Britain to get the first one, and we renamed them Agincourt and Erin and decided they were ours, or Churchill did at the Admiralty. And one of the hate mail letters from with this old Turkish lady who wrote in, say, because they'd been bought by public conscription, basically saying, we paid for those with our hard-earned money and you've stolen from us. I hope God smites you down and kills all of your armies forever and ever, amen. Which was brilliant.
Wow. I mean, I want to talk about going to the civilian aspect now, because as with World War II, it's often the civilians that are the first to suffer the most, and suffer the longest. And one of the couple of the quote photos you sent I pulled down from your Dropbox for this is, you know, people queuing for meat. Then there's the one of the Polish refugees, which I'll get to. Is that, you know, I'm coming at this from a where's the Polish refugees one? There we are. I come at this from a fairly naive about the Great War aspect, but I kind of think of it as the armies go off to war, excited about it, think it'll be over by Christmas. There's that sort of overwhelming confidence, whether you're German, British, French, wherever it be, that it's all going to be swift and conclusive, and it's not going to be terribly bad. But it seems that the civilian suffering, and suffering, I understand, can be different types of thing, and from rationing to actually being victims of, you know, persecution, bombing, blah 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 blah. The civilian aspect, what were your takeaways about from 1941 from that civilian perspective? Pick a country and talk about the one that you moved you the most, kind of thing, Alex, for example.
I'll hand this over to Nicolai, because he wrote about the very worst of it, because he wrote about the Atrocities.
Nicolai?
Yeah. I mean, we always knew that we were going to have to deal with the atrocities that happen, and I think there's this perception that I mean, we know about this what is often called the rape of Belgium, what happened during the German invasion there. But there's also a lot of myth about it. There's from the fact that it didn't happen at all, to the other part that it is overly exaggerated, to somewhere in between where, yeah, it did happen, but it was also exaggerated, and all this. But we of course had to deal with it. But we also wanted to bring in again the global perspective, and also bring in, okay, what happened in the East, what happened in the Balkans. And I think what we sometimes think of is that, okay, there's this in the beginning in Belgium, and then the front sort of settled, and then civilian life was a little bit more easy than perhaps say the Second World War. In the East, the story is quite a bit different, because already from the beginning there's a lot of atrocities that we don't hear a lot about. There's the forced relocation of thousands and thousands of people from the border areas, the sort of national demarcations are much more loose. So there are a lot of Germans living in Russian areas. There's a lot of Russians living in German areas. There's the whole Poland, which is divided between 3 imperial powers. And then you have a front that moves quite a bit more and sweeps back and forward, and of course affects the civilians there quite a bit more. One of the things that I noticed, and we wrote it in the book, is this. For example, if you take a city like Danzig, a German city in the east, in the beginning of the war, they say, okay, we keep putting up our flags for victories, but they're all in the west. By this point, they have not really won anything in the east. The Russians are on the march. They're getting closer and closer. This is before the victory of Tannenberg, but they're much more close to the front, and this of course dampens this enthusiastic mood just by the fact that they are much more on the firing line, or in danger of being directly touched by the war. And then, of course, we have the Balkans, which is a whole different beast, where horrible atrocities happen almost from before the war even really kicks off. I mean, there are massive atrocities happening even before the declaration of war against Serbs in Sarajevo after the killing of the Archduke and his wife. But then the Austro-Hungarian army simply take this to a whole nother level once they cross the border, and the same thing is really also happening in Galicia against the local population there, because nobody really, the armies don't really know what to expect.
Yeah.
They don't really know about what to expect of the civilians. Are they going to support the Russians? Are they going to support the Austrians? Are they going to support the Germans? Are they really more interested in independence? So nobody really trusts them at all. They don't. The soldiers don't want to really take any water from anybody because they're worried they will get poisoned, and there's a lot of sentiment that none of these people can be trusted. And when you don't trust anybody, or you view everybody as an enemy, well, then the line from when you are tired, fighting, scared, to simply just eliminate the problem once and for all by executing these people, well, that becomes a much more go-to option for a lot of these armies. Either that, or you simply remove them, which also happens, that you simply take a lot of areas and say, okay, all these villages just have to move somewhere else, and you create these massive refugee problems that is sort of engineered by the different powers.
I think as well, we decided, didn't we, that once we started picking at this scab, we were absolutely going to do it properly. I know that so Trevor, the Great War Group, has reviewed it for the Great War Group magazine, and said there were a couple of times where he needed to put it down and go for a walk, because I don't know, there seems to be people reading it seem to have had this assumption this was slightly less gruesome than trench warfare, and actually I think it might be worse in some ways. But I mean, we went hard specifically looking for people who articulated being victims of rape as well, because I don't believe that it was a small problem, but trying to find someone who actually gave testimony about it was another thing altogether. And I think we found a couple.
Yeah, and we also, one of the things talking about this myth making or the myths surrounding it, we really went into it also saying, okay, we to sort of, well, not to prove it, because I don't want to dispute it or anything that it happened, but we really wanted also to have the accounts by the perpetrators, because then it becomes clear that this is not a piece of propaganda. When you have the people saying, okay, we went into this village and we hanged 40 people. or we went into this village and shot everybody that we saw because we suspected them to have shot at us, or we simply just wanted to. We have one person who says he just gets caught up in it and starts lighting buildings on fire, because he's I can't exactly put it like remember how he put it, but simply just taken up by everything that's happening and saying, well, we just joined in.
There's the thing, the French one as well, isn't there? The guy that says that there's a trainee priest in his unit who's going after a wounded German, and the guy's just in a frenzy, and he says to him, like, dude, what are you doing? The guy's wounded and he's surrendered. No. But he's just like, the bloodlust is ridiculous. I think it was something we absolutely wanted to cover. I think we were quite careful in terms of getting caught up. So Nicolai had a great source that was meticulously done in the immediate aftermath before the war was even over in the Balkans by one guy. And we're really fortunate to have been chatty with the former mayor of Dinant in Belgium as well. And there's a Belgian source where literally for the centenary, they went out to try and determine exact numbers. And I think if they couldn't find a grave for someone who was on the list, they came off the list in terms of numbers of people. So there have been there's just a lot of what we've done is standing on the shoulders and sort of joining the dots of people who have done really painstaking work about really niche subjects. And our job is really to tie them all together and turn them into like an overarching narrative. But I mean, we managed to draw a line from one oral history at the Imperial War Museum, which is a girl who's scared that, like, so on the outbreak of war, she's in the village wash house with her mum. And a guy comes in from across the road of the pub with a cup of tea and makes a joke that this might be the last cup of tea she has for quite some time. And the girl's terrified, but she doesn't know why. So using that to then draw a line through global trade and all the way back to sort of South America to explain why actually her fear is not completely ridiculous and what it meant. I mean, I never forget the account we've got of Chile, of thousands of miners from the Iquique region. Like, who knew that German soil is not very fertile and needed nitrates brought in from abroad? And 60% of Chile's supply that went out went to Germany, and it suddenly can't move at the beginning of the war. And these miners are all sleeping on the docks, homeless with their families in South America, waiting for someone to send a boat to go and get them so that they can go down out of the mountains and try and find another job. I mean, there's one, I think it's Rosario in Argentina, unemployment goes from 3,000 to 33,000 in about 2.5 weeks. So the idea that any nation was untouched by all of this is ridiculous. And then there's just this little throwaway comment by a German working in Peru who's standing on the docks watching all of these crops rot, where he just says this is 50 years work gone up in smoke.
And it's worth underlining that point there, because again, it's busting the myth that when you look at a picture of the battle lines of the First World War, it does all seem to be just in certain areas. You know, we're back to the Western Front again, or the Gallipoli, those kind of things. And we think of World War II as the one where the whole world was caught up. But you're very eloquently making the point that exactly the same thing happened in the First World War. And you said something right at the beginning of the chat, Alex, about trying to see it through the eyes of 1914. And so when you're talking about, as you are, the rape, the crime, the atrocities, at the time, nobody knew they were going to be in some ways dwarfed by the fact that stuff just goes through the fucking roof in World War II, because we have Shoah, because we have the Holocaust, because we've got what's going on in China. And it goes into the multi-millions of victims in the Second World War. But that doesn't mean that just because it's multi-millions in the Second World War, it may only be hundreds of thousands in the Great War, that means that the hundreds of thousands can be dismissed because it's not as many as in the Second World War. So even with just that little bit you're saying today, that's helping us understand that the Great War is just as, in its own way, just as much of a global conflict, just as all-encompassing, just as many victims across that globe as there were in the Second War, just on a different scale, but no less savage, no less brutal.
Yeah, I think as well, we called it smashing the boxes, didn't we? I think when we first set out and said, if you were going to try and write a war book and it was going to be completely different, what would you do? And we said, like, if you write about the Western Front and you write about the Eastern Front, then you naturally because of your word count and because of trying to allocate enough space for everything, you naturally start reducing your coverage of how they're all linked together. And I think the last third of the book is literally going backwards and forwards from Eastern Front to Western Front to show you how what's going on what happens on one front has a bearing on the other front constantly. Like literally the French, when they get the news that Tannenbergs happen, is absolutely devastating because they're relying on Russia to win the war, like via the back door effectively, so that they don't have to carry on just with the German armies ploughing through France towards Paris. So it was before we even started writing. We called it, when we wrote our pitch for a publisher, we called it smashing the boxes, didn't we?
I think a lot of it is also like what we try to capture as well is that people aren't that different. It is really when you look at it this way, you see that the way say Slovenian subject of the Austro-Hungarian army experienced battle is not very different from how, say, a worker from London experienced.
The big one was the reaction to shell fire, wasn't it? All across Europe, as soon as the shells start flying, everybody has the same reaction on both sides on every battlefield.
Almost the same quotes. Yeah, and I think some of it is also, it brings out the humanity in some groups that we don't hear a lot about, and I think I think some of the most sort of heart-wrenching scenes are some of the ones we see during the battles in the Balkans, with people breaking down under fire, experiencing it for the first time, and you read it, and then a couple of chapters later you have sort of the same reaction happening in some of the big battles on the Western Front, and you see, okay, there isn't that much of a difference. Or sometimes you have people who might not be very good to put it into words because of limitations in how illiterate or literate they are. But the experience of this thing is what we wanted to bring out and really show that it's a universal experience, as well as it is a very different one, if that makes sense.
I think the title as well sums up the approach, doesn't it? We didn't pick our title. The people we wrote about picked it for us, because we had people in Russia, Germany, France, Britain, all of them using the phrase, the world or Europe is a ring of fire. So absolutely, it was. I don't think there was ever even really a debate. It came up so often, didn't it? And I think we've got about half a dozen of them in the book, but it just came up so often with so many different countries of people that couldn't possibly have read it from the other person, that it was a no-brainer.
Yeah, so I was thinking of making a trite comment about the fact you were listening to Johnny Cash when you were writing a manuscript, but I'm not going to now, because that sounds really pathetic, but I have just done it. So we've got a couple of questions I want to deal with, because from the viewers, because that's all part of what we do here. So Sheldrake, the general, is asking, what do Alex and Nikolai think of Margaret Macmillan's argument that many people institutions started the war, but only the Kaiser could have stopped it by withdrawing the blank check? So causations and what started, or it's a potentially large rabbit hole to go down there, but to respond to that particular question,
the Kaiser doesn't have the wherewithal or the power to withdraw the blank check. He's literally told to sit down and shut up when it starts to matter at the end of July. For all of the constitutional stuff about Germany and how he's in charge and that, he really isn't. And like literally, he's just on the verge of tears at one point because he can't get his point across. I think the only person that could have stopped it, and this is the tragic irony of it all, is Franz Ferdinand. He was friends with the Kaiser. He was friends with the Tsar. He had feet in both camps. He, I think, better than the people he left behind, who seized that blank check and caused the First World War in Austria by sending that ridiculous ultimatum to Serbia. He's the one that could have stopped that happening, or he's the one that could have diffused that situation, I think. I don't know what Nikolai thinks.
Yeah, I think you also have to put a lot of blame on AustriaHungary. I mean, they are the ones that started, and I think there were a lot of forces in AustriaHungary going forward, and also a completely delusional thought that you could localize the war.
I think as well,
simply just be a Serbia war.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is that I think we both pretty much agree, and without drawing the wrath of the whole of Hungary, that is the AustriaHungary is a key point, because they're an absolute nightmare, both before, during the crisis, and then after. I mean, Franz Ferdinand had all these ideas for sort of modernizing the Austro-Hungarian Empire when he came to the throne, and they all would have ground to a halt with Hungary. Austria-Hungary don't want to see a dual monarchy divided into a tri-monarchy because their influence is reduced. Likewise, he thought it might be interesting to explore making states along the American system with a federal oversight of it all. Again, absolutely not. I mean, the Hungarian prime minister is one of the worst perpetrators of running the Austro-Hungarian war into what admittedly they thought was a localized war in August 14. And we never talk about, like, I think
I think a lot
talk somewhere where I said we need to talk about Hungary.
And I honestly think that if Austria-Hungary had been able to push through a war against Serbia, say 2 or 3 days after the assassination, they might have actually been able to localize it. The problem is also there's a lot to do with that you let it run for a month, and things sort of quiets down, and everybody thinks that well, it should be solved. And then when they come back, everything seems more unreasonable, more harsh, more unnecessary. In a way, you sort of lose the momentum, if you will,
and control as well, I think.
It's interesting you mentioned Hungary, because with both wars, I think those countries that don't quite sit in the east and don't quite sit in the west end up falling through the cracks. Romania, Hungary, we don't quite know where to define them. We don't quite know where to place them. The east don't think they're part of them. The west don't think they're part of them. So it's kind of that middle Europe bit that we don't even call anything middle Europe. So I think they always end up sort of being ignored. But we got a question, because someone dropped a donation, so of course I'm gonna give their question some priority, because someone's got to pay the electricity bill. So Rami is asking, can you tell us about the Germany against Japan, the fighting in China? Because as you said, a global war. So the east, or the far east, the southeast Asia, whatever you want to call it. Alex?
Yeah, so again, this was my chapter because I did the imperial stuff. So I think the important thing to remember is that everywhere, so Germany's empire is so teeny tiny everywhere that inevitably everywhere they have a territory, they're bordered by enemies on the beginning of the war. Right. And I think the really key thing to remember about the fighting around Japan is that for all of the European powers, fighting here is an absolute afterthought where you don't want to send any resources. Whereas for Japan, it's absolutely everything. So there was only ever going to be one winner. But I think I quote a friend of mine called Jonathan Clements, who writes about Asia a lot, when he said that the Japanese prime minister is the architect of many a previous cunning plan. And he is a devious little shitbag, but it's genius. It's genius what he does. So they start off by they're offering their services to the British. And the British are like, yeah, well, we kind of like Japan to be on our side because we'd really, really like to have your navy over there messing with the Germans, but we want you to do it on our terms. You can hunt down von Spee and do as you're told. And Japan are like, no, we don't like that plan so much because we'd quite like an empire of our own. And they realize, the Japanese, that actually the spoils of what might be up for grabs at the end of this so Japan has all this ambition, but what do? You start a war with a foreign power to try and get it. This sidesteps all of that, because you may end up winning something that you never could have fought for and got in peacetime. So they end up basically just declaring war and going in on their own, and they're ruthless. I mean, their whole plan at Tsingtao, we go up to the moment it's besieged, so we do the initial fight where the Germans track back. So I think the estimate is that to successfully defend Tsingtao, the Germans would have need 40,000 men. By the time they've dialed in every bloke nearby, they have about 700. So it's an absolute hiding to nothing. But I mean, the Japanese plan revolves around sailing around the other side of Cao Bay and landing, and it just conveniently ignores the fact that they're just marching through Chinese soil to do it. So they're basically invading a power that isn't even in it to take a shortcut across to Tsingtao. But I mean, for China asked the Allies if they'd like their services, and the Allies were like, oh, God, no, because I mean, China at this point is in the middle of this century, what they call the century of humiliation. And they're an absolute liability as a prospective ally in terms of the money and resources you'd have to put in them. So nobody wants China to play, basically. They do come in later, and obviously we have the Chinese Labour Corps on the Western Front. But yeah, so they're told no thanks. So the Japanese just stomp through Chinese soil to get to Tsingtao and go overland, basically. So yeah, that was a fun one to write up. I mean, we managed to find some really good first-hand accounts, and we managed to find sort of this really there's a Japanese officer who has a really heroic day when it comes to taking the high ground above Tsingtao. So yeah, that was fun to write, I think. And then the other thing is that chapter is Tsingtao, but it's also the fact that Australians and New Zealanders are rightly obsessed with Gallipoli, but it's not their first fight. I mean, New Zealand, all of the white dominions, and Britain's unique for this because Britain has these white dominions throughout the globe who offer to pick a fight nearby at the very beginning, which totally eradicates the need for Britain to send any troops. So they're like, hell yes, please do what you can. So there's a load of sub-imperialism going on at play as well. So New Zealand go for Samoa. And what they're doing is taking out German communications across the globe and silencing them. So yeah, so they take Samoa, which is 1,000 miles from the Cook Islands, but that's close in the Pacific. They're like next door. So that makes sense. And the Australians, obviously, I think they have Papua, but they want Guinea as well. So they go and take that. So actually we cover the first Australian officer to die in the war in some detail, and we talk about there's basically a whole chapter about Asia and the Pacific, which was really cool for me given my World War II interests as well.
Yeah, I mean, and you made that, the descriptions of the book, you're talking about some of the curious things about where the first shots were fired and where the first things happened. And as you said there, Nikolai, about the Balkans, things happening there and people being nervous about combat, and then the same things happening on the Western Front, weeks, months down the line. But I'm not going to ask you to kind of give us a list of the myths you debunk, because that's silly. That's the kind of thing you can do on social media in 20 words. Obviously, this is a big book that goes into these things and explains it over a multitude of chapters. But are there any things about 1914 that the average viewer, anything still left that is a perception that's actually true? I mean, Phil Blood asked the question about the spirit of 1914. So, when you went into this and you did all this multiple archives and multi-language research, but at the end of it, were there any of those things about that year that we think are true that actually are true, that we can go, yeah, you know what, that really was a thing back then?
I think for me, one of the big ones was that we decided that you should be able to pick this book up and put it in any language, and it would still proportionately be fair. Everybody would have their fair participation in the book, and for that reason, like Nicolai says, there's a shockingly small number of pages, because the Battle of Mons is a skirmish. It's part of a huge battle of the frontiers. I mean, we're looking at millions of Germans, millions of French, millions of Russians, millions of Austro-Hungarians, and about 80,000 British straight off the bat in World War I. So that's how tiny Britain's contribution in terms of land warfare is. I mean, most of the naval stuff is British. We do cover a clash that's mainly the French army at Antivari, but most of the naval stuff will be British, because that's fair, because Britain has complete dominance of the seas. But I think if people are going in there expecting to see a huge chapter on the Battle of Mons, what you'll see is that it's proportionally stuck in the Battle of the Frontiers, exactly where it belongs, which is side by side with the French Fifth Army at Charleroi. But yeah, I wonder if some people might be disappointed at the lack of British stuff, but it wasn't.
It's not like there aren't a few books out there about that. If people
go
into 1 hour of the first day of the Somme or whatever in 1916, they can do that. So it's this is about 1914. It's about that global view. So what
you asked about? About something that sort of turned out to be true. And I think one of the things is the unpreparedness that we sometimes talk about, that the armies were unprepared, because what our book the time frame, what we actually wanted to do with the time frame, and where we decided to cut it. This went from being the idea of a multi-volume work of the whole war to, okay, then we do one volume of 1914 to, okay, there's actually enough for us to do just the beginning few weeks and just really do that properly and in depth and with everything. But the cutoff is basically where everybody's plan is sort of over. Everybody's initial war plans have failed, or I think the only one you can say has succeeded at that point is perhaps Serbia, which managed to beat off an Austro-Hungarian invasion. But that's as far as their own war plan goes, is just to survive, and they managed to actually survive. But basically, everything is about, okay. So we deal with the German failed invasion to win the war in the West and then turn everything against Russia. Well, that fails in the Marne. That's where we cut it in the West. In East Prussia, we go with the Russian plan to invade East Prussia and support the French, and then up until the point where they lose at Tannenberg, and that goes wrong. And then in Galicia, you have the Austro-Hungarian invasion to see if you can do anything against the Russians, and until the retreat, which interestingly also happens to be ordered on the exact same day that the Battle of the Marne ends. So it makes for a pretty nice cut. Now, if you have a broad knowledge of the First World War, you might read it and say, okay, there was also this thing happening in East Prussia within this time frame of some of the other, or more things happened in the Balkans after where we cover. But that is because what we really cut off the point is where everything is failed, and at that point where you have to realize you have to do something completely different than what you thought. This is a different kind of beast than to what you had expected, and I think that is the thing that we sort of understand, and that is confirmed throughout the book, that generals and people, both civilians and soldiers, were not prepared for the scale and the intensity and the deadly, just how violent and deadly this was. I mean, you have just the scale of it. I mean, when we're looking at these, we also look at the Western Front. We've concentrated. We talked about the Guns of August. It's almost all about the Western Front and this big German invasion going down towards Paris. Well, in just half of the Eastern Front, which is the Galicia, you have 1.4 million men clashing. I mean, you have 4 Austro-Hungarian armies fighting against at 1.6 Russian armies. I mean, these are massive scale battles that are fought. So this is on a whole nother level. So in that way, I think we will confirm that this is just a different kind of war. We are entering a different kind of period of warfare.
I think we kind of agree as well. If we were going to do another one, you could do up until the end of 1914. If you were to do October and November, we could do the same again, but in telling everybody how those static fronts are born, because that's what happens in the next few weeks.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
And then
the fluidity changes. Yeah. So you both said things there, Nikolai. You said that no one was prepared for how brutal it was going to get and the length of it, and generals down to private soldiers and civilians. But let's say theoretically, I'm not putting any pressure on you. Start doing another 1914 volume, then a couple of 215, 1915, 16, 17. With all these eyewitnesses that you discovered, was there anybody you thought, if there's someone's story I'd like to follow in the future, it's that person there? Was there someone who showed that sign of perhaps being a little bit pragmatic or visionary or seeing the future, be it a French civilian or a British person? Is there kind of one person that you thought, you know what, I'd like to follow their story?
I'm an absolute sellout. We've just waffled on about doing things for ordinary men, women and children. I've absolutely fallen in love with General Foch, and I would absolutely, if I had to do a biography of any one person, because I mean, he smashes it on the Marne. He really does. And like I said to Nicolai, I was like, have you proofread for the last time? Have you finished proofreading the Marne? He was like, yeah. I was like, did you nearly cry? And he was like, yeah, a little bit. So when that we've got this whole string of Frenchmen up and down the line who realise they've won on the Marne. And I find when I was reading the audio book, I was trying not to cry. It was pathetic. But because his story is not just, he doesn't smash it the whole way through the war. He makes mistakes, but then obviously he ends up being supreme commander on the Western Front of everybody, including the British and stuff. So I'd love to write a biography.
And you could easily do a nice road trip, just going round France, going to all the cities that have got a massive, great statue of him or a street named after him.
I mean, there's even one outside Victoria Station in London, and it was supposed to be, this is part of my tour.
I saw that. I walked past that 3 days ago. Yeah.
So it was supposed to be the other way round and about 50 meters in the other direction. And then some genius said, no, we should point it at the exit of Victoria Station so that when his countrymen come across the channel and get the boat train up to London, they'll see him when they come out. And I think, I would love to write about him.
Yeah, I think.
And Nikolai, anyone for you?
Yeah, and it's because I've probably cheated a little bit and know what happens to the person also a little bit. But I think it's fascinating to follow some of the private soldiers, and there's particularly one that we meet called I think Andreas Kühling, who is a Danish soldier. And when you follow what happens to some of these men, and I think particularly him, I think he's one of them. If you look at where they go through the war, it sort of underlines just how global this conflict is, because I think he enters on, I think it's the 4th of August, he enters Belgium, and then he fights through that invasion. They end up in Belgium somewhere. They're sent to the Eastern Front to fight the Russians. At one point, they go back, they fight at Verdun. Then they're sent to, I believe, Serbia, and also... the Macedonian front in the Balkans, and then they're sent to I believe they're some of the ones that are then sent to the Eastern Front again, and sort of fight after the Russians basically sue for peace, but the Germans continue their push against the Soviets, and I think he ends the war in Georgia, in the Caucasus, and has to find his way home from there. So I think that journey to now that we've looked at where some of these people started, and to see some that made it, and just that journey crisscrossing the globe in a way, and going into countries that we talked about were neutral in the beginning, suddenly ending up in these areas. I think that's fascinating too.
I think it's interesting you said that, because even just the way you said crisscrossing the globe, because a lot of people, when they think of the First World War, that's the last thing they think about. They think of whatever bit you're involved in, you're stuck somewhere, and it's usually in a trench, and it's with mice and rats running under your feet, and maybe rice, I don't know, and all that kind of stuff. And what you've done already, you two of you, is you reminded us that the whole world is involved, and the 1914 period is about movement, and as you said there, the control of borders and frontiers and empires and all that, and it's the spirit of mobilization. So we will leave it there, but you never know, we might bring you both back and carry on another conversation with some more questions there. But as always, folks, there are links to purchase the book in the description below, or you can find it at your favorite bookstore or online, or whatever resource you use. And it's got a different cover in the USA than the UK, so don't get confused, folks. That they do that these days, don't they, publishers? So well, unless you've got a final word from you, Alex, then Nikolai, then we'll bring it to an end.
I think the only thing I would say is that all of this stuff that's been on the news the last few weeks about tariffs, a year ago I wouldn't have had a clue what's going on. But if you read this book and then you go back to what's been in the news, you'll be like, yeah, I see why the whole world's shit in their pants at this point.
See, I don't have no idea what this all tariff. Well, I kind of half know, but
I start that chapter with that. I literally said, global trade is not a sexy topic of conversation, but and touch wood, the stuff coming back is that people are like, no, it's not, but it's actually been done in a way that hopefully is readable, and it doesn't just mire people in statistics.
And Nikolai, final word from you.
Basically just that I hope really a lot of people will enjoy it and find something that they didn't know. I think that was what we set out to do, to tell this old story that has been done to death, and really say, okay, we want to do it in a way that's different. And I really hope that we've succeeded. And from the people who've read it so far, it seems that we've partly succeeded.
I think we said as well, didn't we, that we wanted to make it so that if any one person comes up and says, "Oh yeah, I knew all of that already," they lie.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, that's. I wouldn't expect anything like other than you making a nice, bold, confident statement like that. So I shall wait for you to bring me over a nice, signed, dedicated copy in July. I've got my pile of shame is just ridiculous right now. I have to get planning permission for it soon, because
how big is my pile of shame in your house that I have the French?
I've got one or two books sitting there waiting for you that you've sent me. But yeah, it's brilliant stuff. Brilliant talking to you guys. So yeah, and it was nice to bring back at least a temporary resurrection of World War I TV. There's still life in the channel. We will push on things, but we don't know exactly how and when. But in the meantime, thanks for watching us on both channels. Nothing from me tomorrow, but I'm back on Friday on World War II TV with Becky Aikman, talking about the women who went off the USA to deliver Spitfires and lots of stuff like that. So click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, and I'll see you all on the other side. Cheers, everybody. Bye.